Janina Ramirez is a British art and cultural historian and TV presenter who specialises in interpreting symbols and examining works of art within their own historical context. Nikki Gamble met with Janina to talk about her debut children's novel, Riddle of the Runes, a thrilling Viking mystery teeming with Norse mythology.
You're an established cultural historian and broadcaster with a long string of research credentials. One of the things that struck me when I read Riddle of the Runes is that your central character Alva and her uncle solve the mystery in a way that feels as though they're interrogating evidence, a little bit like historians.
I really love that suggestion. I think when I was writing those sections, as far as I'm concerned, Magnus he's her uncle, he's Alva's uncle, and he has travelled widely. He's read a lot, which in this world of the Viking Norse, they're not technically literate in as much as they're not writing things down, reading books in the same way as perhaps you'd find in ancient Rome or in Christian Anglo-Saxon England. But he's been exposed to an awful lot. And yeah, as the book unfolds, we get the suggestion that he's been into Islamic worlds, and he comes back with things like magnifying glasses. And yeah, as the books progress, you'll see some of the technology that he's getting from the Middle East. So he is clearly well-travelled. And I think what his travels and his education have shown him is that while he is firmly Viking and he still holds to the old gods and to the traditions, he embraces innovation and technology and ideas. And Alva has been brought up exposed to that. That's been countered by her mother, Brianna, who comes with all this sense of Celtic folklore and tales as an Irish princess, and her own father, who we learn as the books go on is an old romantic. He loves romance novels. So all of them are bringing different sorts of learnings to the table. And I think as far as the role of the historian is concerned, it's never far from my mind. So when they're unfurling maps and when they're discovering, runic clues and objects, that's what I do. That's what I do in my job. And I have to be quite careful and discerning. I've always said being an early medievalist is a bit like having a 1,000-piece jigsaw puzzle with just a couple of pieces. And you've got to be very careful not to extrapolate a whole world from one thing. And I think that's what I try and get Alva and Magnus to do, is to be discerning.
The early medieval world that Alva lives in is an expansive one. You show us how well-travelled some people were at that time.
Yes, yeah. Connection points are important to me. I think as a medievalist, you sort of by default become interdisciplinary. So I started off my degree in English language and literature. I wanted to be a writer of children's fiction when I was 12, 11, 13, that age. And so I wanted to study literature, I wanted to study great books, but because I fell in love with the poetry of Old English and later of Middle English and, as you say, of Old Norse and the Vikings, I wanted to understand their world, and so drew upon art, archaeology, historical documents, manuscripts, paleography. All of that crossed over for me. And what I started to realise as well is that these are worlds that exist alongside each other. They're not exclusive. They are constantly in flux and in exchange. And the Vikings, more than anybody, show you that. They travel so far and they encounter so many different parts of the world and different cultures and people that they become sort of a cauldron, a melting pot for all that's exciting and interesting about the early medieval period for me.
Tell us about your interest in paleography.
I think it was one of the most amazing discoveries when I realised there was this whole area of study that focused on essentially handwriting. So it used to be a joke, isn't it, that if you got a medical doctor to write you a prescription, you needed somebody to decipher the handwriting. And so paleography is that. It is the deciphering of the handwriting of specific schools and specific scribes across time. And there are wonderful patterns. So you can go to particular monasteries like Lindisfarne up in Northumberland, where you will see a really distinctive handwriting that all the monks were trained to use. It's called insular script, and it's got this, you'll recognise it from Lindisfarne mead bottles. It's this sort of very rounded lettering. And then you'll go to somewhere like Merovingian Gaul, where it is almost impenetrable. The handwriting of the script is so difficult to decipher. And and what is wonderful about this is we end up, I think, as literary scholars, studying texts that have often been handwritten. It's only post-printing press. It's only in the last sort of 400 or 500 years that things have been recorded in lovely, clear, legible text. But everything before that is handwritten, and we end up relying very heavily on editors and translators for how we understand the original text. So we depend on a paleographer to have gone in and said, this is what Beowulf actually says on the only surviving manuscript. And then we read it in a beautiful, tidied up, printed version. But I loved this idea of the detective work involved in going back to the original objects, the manuscripts themselves, the objects, things like the Frank's casket that I used as the inspiration for the casket Alva discovers. Those objects were witnesses at the time. They were there. They saw the events that unfolded 1,000 years ago. And if they could speak to us like humans do, they would be our witnesses. And that's why I want to go back as far as possible to original source material, because it's true and it's faithful, and it gives you a real sense of the time in a way that you don't get through sort of picking a nice 99p translation book off the shelf. So, and it does also appeal to the inner detective in me. I love this idea of code breaking and things that other people don't know. I can crack the code.
But how do you know if you've broken the code accurately?
It depends. Code breaking is fascinating in the sense of, if you think of a code as 1 + 1 = 2. That's one form of code where you are literally trying to break something that has been deciphered and encoded and encrypted. But there are other types of code breaking, particularly in the world of art history and in the world of poetry and literature, where ambiguity is almost part of it, that you are expected to be challenged to find often more than one answer. So riddles would be the ultimate way that manifests. So, I've called the book Riddle of the Runes. And when we think about Tolkien was Professor of Old English Literature at Oxford. He created the riddles of Gollum and of the different characters in his books on the basis of centuries of early medieval riddle working. And there's a wonderful term that comes out of this world, which is multivalence. It was coined by an academic called Eamon O'Carrigan, and he said that Anglo-Saxon and Viking art, it doesn't need to have just one solution. 2 or more multiple solutions can exist at the same time, and that adds to the complexity and adds to the adventure of trying to decipher something. So he said multivalence, their poetry is multivalent, their art is multivalent, and I love that. I love the lack of that it doesn't need to be entirely conclusive. I think that's why I'm not a scientist. That's why I study the humanities and art and literature, because every individual's mind can create a different alternative universe. So for me, the multivalence is part of the beauty of it.
The history of Britain is inextricably interwoven with the English language and the routes it has travelled. I love the way that you brought this out in your story.
Well, weirdly, I didn't realise quite how interesting the history of language was. I found it baffling at first. I went to an inner city school where we didn't really do grammar. It was only when I was exposed to Latin I suddenly thought, oh my goodness, there's parts of speech and there's verbs decline, because for me, I just wasn't taught it in that way. I wasn't taught language as sort of building blocks and grammatical formulas. But when I started doing the history of language, that's when it really became exciting for me, because it did make sense. It made sense that individual people move places, and as they move places, they take their language, their terms, their words with them. So as the Vikings are travelling over to the edges of America and over into Russia and down into Constantinople, as they're going into all these worlds, they're taking with them stories of Thor and of Freya and of Odin, and they're taking their parts of speech with them. And that is the movement of language. And our English language is founded on exactly those sorts of immigrations and cross-communications. And that's what makes it so beautiful. I love surprising people by telling them that, of course, the days of the week are all named after Viking gods. And yet it seems such a basic unit of our modern day world that we talk about Thor's Day and Woden's Day. But it's got this history, this legacy that goes back over 1,000 years. So I think linguistic code breaking is really fascinating. I think what will happen as the series develops, because it's going to be 4 books in the series, is the travel will become even more of a component, and the crossing over of cultures and the meeting of minds that's going to take place in different geographical regions. I'm so excited to keep writing.
We tend to think of mixed marriage as belonging to a modern world, but ethnicities and cultures are very mixed in your portrayal of the early medieval world.
Exactly. Well, my relatives are Irish and Polish. My husband's are Spanish and Scottish, and so my children are a quarter of each. And to me, that's a part of a story. But I'm fascinated by English history, regardless. It's a place I find myself growing up. But I'm constantly on the lookout for these sorts of connections. And so when I came up with Alva and her heritage, it actually came out of research I'd done into Iceland, into the early settlers of Iceland. It was discovered that the Y chromosome, the majority of the male population that first settled Iceland, which is a fascinating case study because human beings didn't actually live on Iceland until the 9th century. So it's this sort of absolutely condensed human history of just over 1,000 years. And it's funny that in Iceland now, children can trace their genealogy back generation after generation. They all know who they're related to. But the original skeletons that came with the first settlers were mostly coming from Viking males and Irish females. So these were obviously through trade links, because Dublin, of course, is a Viking city, and they were taking women with them and settling new lands. And so these generation of storytellers, of Icelandic saga spinners, they are half Irish, half Viking, or Scandinavian. And just through that sort of nugget of information, it set my imagination whirring of, oh, well, if I'm going to create this character, I want her to have this sort of a background of storytelling and fantasy and legacy. And so Brianna plays actually quite an important symbolic role in the book, as much as just being a very cool, feisty female figure. I didn't want an orphan. I didn't want another child who's sort of, soulless and rudderless. I wanted the book to be about family and about actually how complicated family can be. So family is right at the forefront of the book all the way through, and it will be through the whole series.
I love a book with a map, and you've thoughtfully provided one for us. What sorts of maps and aids did the Vikings have to help them navigate?
Oh, I think my first love was topography and maps, because my poor husband, he has to take me out almost like a Labrador at the weekends, and I'll just put a pin in a map and we'll just go and find it. And this idea of creating a bird's eye view of the world, where we're looking down, is something so recent. Really, mapping in the way that we know it began maybe 600, 700, 800 years ago. But people have always heard the concept of journeys. And in the early Anglo-Saxon period, it was a bit more like a bus route or a train line, where, if you think about if you get on the tube, you'll show how each of the points along the way are a line. And we have lots of records like that from the Anglo-Saxon period, where, particularly on the route to Jerusalem, where they sort of say, well, you can stop off here at Caen, and then you can go over into, these parts of Italy. And then as the period progresses, they start to put in coastlines, because, of course, you can traverse around coastlines and measure the sorts of distances that you're travelling. But they don't really get this sense of being a bird looking down until sometime later. And a lot of that innovation is coming again from the Islamic world. They're coming up with very early navigation tools. I don't want to give too much of a clue away to book 2, but a lot of book 2 is going to be about the Vikings, the way that the Vikings were able to travel, what devices they used, some really amazing things like sunstones, which we didn't really know if they existed or not until recently. Like shield maidens themselves, in fact. My entire concept of a shield maiden was founded on literary analogies, and then this year, a burial was reanalyzed 100 years. It was discovered 100 years ago, Viking warrior burial in Burka, and DNA analysis revealed that it wasn't a male warrior; it was a female warrior. So we could finally say, yeah, there were definitely shield maidens, trained women warriors. And that's a bit like the same with these navigation tools. Discoveries are being made month after month after month, and particularly old discoveries that were first made over, in what we would call the Victorian period. Scholars are going back to them and saying, well, hang on a minute, if we found one female warrior in a grave, maybe we should go back to the DNA of hundreds of early excavated bones, because we all assumed they were men because they had swords with them and shields with them. But let's have a look at their DNA, and it's the same with a lot of the ships. The sunstone is a particularly interesting one because they didn't know if it would work, but a form of quartz has been discovered that will locate on a cloudy day the position of the sun in the sky, so that they could use that to navigate east-west. So all of these things are coming, they're all happening, and it's so exciting. I mean, I find being an early medievalist is like being a detective, as I said earlier. And every time a new discovery is made, it makes you reassess the whole picture. It makes you sort of try and bring it all back into focus again. But travel and maps are very interesting. I've been very fortunate to spend time working with early medieval maps, things like the Mappa Mundi and things like the monastic maps that were coming out, particularly out of the 11th, 12th century. And it's exactly like I described in the book. It is sort of showing, this is my monastery here, and these are all the other monasteries around me that I may be able to go on pilgrimage through. And so I wanted Alva and Magnus to be surprised by this potential new resource. It's like showing an academic from the 80s the internet. It blows their mind a little bit that they could be following these maps.
You've chosen a female protagonist who is not only quick-witted, but is also physically strong. How authentic are the freedoms that you've accorded her with what you know about the period?
I find that all fascinating, what you're saying, because it sort of reinforces something that I haven't analysed closely, but it was very much a sort of subconscious awareness when I was growing up, that most of what I was reading, most of the books I was fascinated by, and most of my school texts, they were both male and empirical. So they were sort of giving you truths. They were saying, this is what happened at the Battle of 1066. This is the fact. Whereas I think what happened, both with gender, waking up of the 60s and 70s with different voices coming in, not just female voices, but people of different races, people of different classes, was maybe empirical truth was starting to be challenged a bit. So instead of just saying, these are the facts of 1066, we'd say, well, what are the different viewpoints? What are the different alternatives to this? And I was very fortunate, I think, as an academic, to grow up with those multiple viewpoints. And so I've always been aware of it. I've never felt the need to be a sort of drum-banging feminist until recently, actually. I always just felt that I'd find my own voice and find my own place. But for me, it was very, very important that I wrote a book that showed a period in time, where women were empowered. And it's the reason I think, weirdly, I've ended up focusing on the Anglo-Saxons and the Vikings so much. My first book, the book on the Private Lives of Saints, is a factual historical book. And then I wrote about Julian of Norwich, the first female writer in English. And I find these strong women voices coming through, people like St. Hilda of Whitby, and Julian herself. And these are people that I think were exceptional. They were women in men's worlds who were able to hold their own, make their mark, and really be taken seriously. But in the Viking world, more than I think at a lot of other historical periods, women had a very good chance at equal rights a lot of the time. So legally, they had more rights than they've had at other times. They could divorce a husband for certain things. They, partly because the men were travelling so much, going away for months of the year, they had complete control of the home, of the treasure chest, of the farmstead. They would do all these things. And also there is this implication right from, religious framework upwards, that women could be warriors. Women were the Valkyries. They swept over the battlefield. Women were Lagertha, the shield maiden of legend. And so they have physical power as well as mental and emotional power, which we often get in other cultures and other texts. But for me, I wanted them to be strong. I was strong. I grew up with a brother doing judo, playing football. I felt I was physically strong. I felt I could hold my own. And I never found a book that showed me a heroine that could do that. There was always a clever heroine. There was always someone who'd, could outwit the boys, or come up with a solution when the boys were all being strong and floundering, a bit like Hermione Granger. But I wanted Alva to be physically strong and to be able to determine her own fate through her strength as well as through her mind. But it's amazing how quickly and easily she wrote herself. She was just fully formed for me. And I think the main problem I found was authenticity. I was never going to cross that historical authentic line. I wasn't going to create some sassy, modern day girl who's being all cheeky to her parents or disrespectful to the elders, because that simply wouldn't have been the case. She'd have been driven out of the village if she'd been disrespectful. But there's a point at which she pushes the boundaries, and that's what I wanted to explore. And she's about as sort of modern and edgy a heroine as I think you can get from a historical kids book.
What are the differences in the way you approach writing for children compared to the other forms of writing that you do?
I find that there's degrees of interpretation that come when you write. So if I'm writing my thesis or an academic article, I can be very detailed, I can be very factual, I can show off all the wonderful little bits of evidence I've found. If I'm trying to write a popular history book, I need to be able to have it read by a general reader, someone with an interest, but I need to make it approachable. If I'm writing adult fiction, I can still talk to the reader as if they're an adult like myself. But when you're writing children's fiction, you need to take it that step further. You need to be so clear in your communication skills that anybody can understand it. And that's why I think really good children's fiction is timeless and ageless, because what it is truly about is the purest form of communicating emotion, ideas, location, thoughts. It's paring it down, and that's what makes it just such a challenge and such a pleasure.
Finally, in your view, what's the purpose of history? Does it have relevance for children today?
It's such a good question, and again, there are as many answers as there are historians or people who are interested in the past, because everybody who looks to the past for inspiration is doing it for their own reasons. There might be a military historian who's fascinated by the art of war and what makes people violent and aggressors towards one another. I personally am a cultural historian. I'm fascinated by the things that spark me. I want to write original ideas down as a fiction writer, and I'm fascinated by the people from 1,000 years ago who also did that. The myth makers, the artists, the storytellers, the poets. I'm fascinated by them, and I think that what you take out of of studying the past is the infinite complexity of life. It's like looking at the present through different lenses. We could look at it for its economics, its politics, its social history, and its humanities, the literature, the poetry, the music that's being written today. Historians do all of that, but they project it backwards. And what that teaches you, it doesn't just teach you about your immediate environment, it teaches you about where we've come from and where we're going to. And I genuinely don't think we learn necessarily how to avoid mistakes from learning about history, but I think we learn more about ourselves as human beings from studying history, and what makes us fallible and what makes us get things wrong and get things right, and what survives the passage of time. Why does Shakespeare endure? Why does Chaucer endure? Why does something like the Wilton diptych, why does it still look so beautiful after 700 years? That's what really excites me, and so I love the rich and the beautiful and the culturally vibrant that is still as potent today as it was then. And I think a good piece of poetry like The Wanderer, the Old English poem The Wanderer, it's as beautiful now to a reader's ear as it was 1,000 years ago, and I want to understand why.